Welcome to the Living Medicine podcast, where we talk about ethical medical use of psychedelic psychotherapy, teaching skills, examining the issues, and interviewing interesting people. Now let's start today's show. Hi, and welcome to Living Medicine, where we bring together community for ketamine and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy providers. This is your host, Signe Goldman. Be sure to check out our recent episodes with Michael and Annie Mithofer, renowned MAPS psychedelic researchers, as well as Dick Schwartz, the creator of Internal Family Systems, talking about his encounters with unusual psychedelic experiences doing parts work. Today, we're going to feature Sandy's recent interview with Dr. Ron Siegel of Harvard University, author and thought leader, frankly, in mindfulness and contemplative practice. He's talking today about the interface between mindfulness practice and psychedelics, with its interesting implications for why are human beings able to access altered states in the first place, and what does this say about healing? Enjoy.
Well, I am excited, everyone. I am Dr. Sandy Newis, and I am here with Dr. Ron Siegel, who I'm thrilled to be interviewing and have the opportunity to do so. I have been following Dr. Siegel's work, as I'm sure many of you have, from the beginning when I was like a baby clinician. And I don't know if it was the first book, but it was the one I found, the Mindfulness and Psychotherapy book that sat on my shelf and is still on my shelf for the longest time and really began to inform my work and my work with applying mindfulness into psychotherapy. And I have been following you ever since, Dr. Siegel. So I'm utterly thrilled to be here and to have this opportunity to do so. So
thanks so much
for an opportunity. Yeah, you would like to kind of introduce yourself just a little bit? I don't know which parts of your, wonderful background to really highlight.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. And so I'm Ron Siegel. I'm a psychologist on the faculty here at Harvard Medical School, where I've been for a very, very long time, many decades. And as Sandy just said, I've had a focus on the integration of mindfulness practices and more recently, I think, compassion practices as well into psychotherapy, and both how what we know from these ancient wisdom traditions can inform modern psychotherapy, and how modern psychotherapy, neuroscience, clinical science might be able to enrich some of the wisdom traditions that these other practices come from. And all of this has also some lovely synergies with the current renaissance and interest in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So my interests stand at the crossroads of all of those things.
I love that. So this conversation, I was just, continuing to kind of appreciate the privilege that I had to spend a week in Costa Rica with you, where you were teaching as part of Mindfulness Travels with Dr. Larry Camerata and Linda Camerata as part of their program, and was kind of, I was aware of the fact that you had really come out as being really into that application with psychedelic medicine and non-ordinary states, but it was kind of a delightful surprise of me to have that opportunity to really do a deep dive into this. So I thought it would be really interesting to just kind of review some of that and just talk about how that really applies to psychedelic psychotherapy.
Sure.
Specifically the clinical application of mindfulness and non-ordinary states and interventions that go with that.
Right. And, personally, the synergies among these things are quite central to my life, because I probably would have been a mechanical engineer or some such. As a kid, I was the one who, took apart the machines and tried to figure out how they worked, and was very interested in science. And it really wasn't until some powerful psychedelic experiences in adolescence that suddenly I was interested in the mind in a very different way, and very interested in, so how can some of these non-dual states that seem to be so true and so important, how can we find them without just taking psychedelics? How can we make them more part of our lives? And that's actually what led me to mindfulness practice, and that's what led me to become a psychologist.
I love it. I love the fact that people like yourself, and I guess myself too, can really that there's a time now in the culture and the science and the research that's driving it that we can actually say that. So I wanted to there was a particular thread of your teaching that I found super interesting. And I was just wondering if we could start with that. You really talked about the 4 propensities of the mind. And I've seen you give other talks about that. And in particular, you said your brain evolved to keep you alive long enough to procreate and to allow your kids to live in optimal conditions to help them procreate too. So I was wondering if you could just kind of speak to that piece. And then really maybe we could move into the 4 propensities and speak about the specifics of those.
Sure. Yeah. You've probably heard the phrase, the selfish gene. It doesn't mean that genes are like little people with their own volition, but that's what it looks like when we reverse engineer natural selection. In other words, if we look at an existing organism, say a mouse or a human, and we say, so how come it's constellated this way? And we can understand the way it's constellated, at least by Darwinian understanding, that there were historically random mutations. And those random mutations, which might facilitate the organism surviving long enough to reproduce, and then the kids surviving, those are the ones we're going to see currently still existing in the genotype and the phenotype. And the ones that didn't work out so well, they fell away. So we could understand that whatever we see in the organization of the human brain is largely based on this. It's also based, of course, on what happens in our individual development, and it's based on what happens in cultural evolution as well. But a lot of the genetic underpinnings, and putting epigenetics aside for the moment, have to do with that which allowed us to survive. And think about this, and several people have noticed that there's some pretty strong propensities of the brain that were quite good for survival, but especially in the context of modern life, make us thoroughly miserable. And it seems to me that one of the reasons why humans have gravitated both toward psychedelics as one form of non-ordinary state or expanded state of consciousness, as well as developed all sorts of contemplative practices, from yoga to mindfulness practice to visualization practices, and developed all sorts of things like sweat lodges and fasting and chanting. And the list is actually quite long, that we developed these basically as antidotes to these propensities of the brain that were great for survival, but they're terrible for well-being.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is all of these different strategies and these tools and these methods that we have developed really to expand consciousness, which sometimes I also I'm always kind of curious about the way that's expand consciousness versus regulate our nervous system, right? In the way that they may or may not be the same, but are antidotes to that to kind of get past some of the suffering that.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I think so. And just to go down that tangent that you introduced for a second, I think most of these expanded states of consciousness or non-ordinary states that are useful to us require a certain degree of regulation of the nervous system, because when we're in fight or flight, which as modern humans, we spend a lot of time in fight or flight. I'm in fight or flight every time I open my email. I'm like, what's going to be threatening here to me now? What's going to make me feel bad about myself, right? Given that, very often these expanded states involve something that starts with relaxing the nervous system, opening in some way, and shifting from fight or flight to some more open and curious state. So I think there is a relationship between what we might think of as emotion regulation or nervous system regulation and these expanded states. Although you can have nervous system regulation and very much not have an expanded state of consciousness. Take benzodiazepines, for example. You'll feel quite cooled out, but I'm not sure they're going to predispose us toward insights, toward shifts of perspective, toward stepping out of the thought stream, toward some of the other benefits that we can get from expanded states of consciousness.
It's just an interesting balance to kind of play with. And one of the things I love is that you're bringing that piece into the discussion of mindfulness. So often, in my experience, which I know is not fully accurate, it's so much about thoughts. And so to really bring the body and the brain and the nervous system online is something I really appreciate about what you're offering here. So I just wondered if it might make sense then to talk about the different propensities. So the first one that you talked about was the propensity of the brain to gravitate towards nutrients, safety, and other things necessary for survival and away from danger.
Yeah, so this one is perhaps the most basic, because organisms as relatively simple as bacteria do this, right? They will retreat from a toxin and they'll go for nutrients. And the way this shows up in humans is kind of two broad systems that are involved in this. One of them is indeed our fight or flight system, the way in which we, totally recoil from danger and seek safety. And the other is our drive system, the way we seek food when we're hungry, or we seek, liquids when we're thirsty, or we seek sexual contact when we have sexual arousal, or we seek to, build a shelter when it starts to get cold out. Yeah. So that one is very basic. And the interesting thing is it makes total sense. Obviously, we want to flee predators and danger and get our basic needs met. And it works pretty well in the physical realm, but in the emotional realm, it turns out to be a recipe for disaster. And I can perhaps give some examples of that.
Yeah, if you could, I'd love to hear that. Just how is it that the emotional realm becomes a recipe for disaster when really it's a survival need that we're trying to meet?
Well, let's see. I'll just ask among our viewers here. I won't be able to see you, but raise your hand if you drink alcohol at least occasionally, in some settings, right? Many of us do that, right? and then it's like, raise your hand if you do it exclusively for the taste. And then the hands go up from the people from Northern California and, and Chile and Italy. But a lot of us who aren't from one of those places say, well, exclusively for the taste? I'm not sure about that. And one of the images I like to think about is imagining our ancestors discovering that, oh yeah, by the bend of the river, there's this really good fruit tree. And they go there and they get some yummy fruit one day. And then they go back, a couple of weeks later, and the fruit's all fallen on the ground and it's looking kind of punky, but they're hungry. So, they pick up a piece of fruit and they taste it. It doesn't really taste as good as it did when it was on the tree. But, about, 10 minutes later, they get this kind of warm feeling and they feel kind of more relaxed and less worried about where the next meal's going to come from. They say, where do you get more of that rotten fruit? Right. And after a while, we develop the absolute world's most colorful and tasty drug delivery system, which is like what you see in a bar. Right. And we start gravitating toward this. So why do we do it? Well, I think it's all about changing one state that's less pleasant into a state that's more pleasant. So, for those of you who are clinicians, it's a hard day of clinical work. And if you're anything like me, musculoskeletally, you look kind of like this, and you think, well, a glass of wine wouldn't be the worst thing right now, right? Or you're going to a party and there are going to be people there you don't know, or sometimes worse, people there who you do know. And you think, I think I'll start with a cocktail. We want to change one state into another. And doing this from time to time, okay, no issue. But we know substance use problems, they're huge. And at the heart of all of them is trying not to feel something painful, trying to feel something more pleasurable. We see this with anxiety. If I get nervous before public speaking or flying in an airplane, but I do those things anyway, I don't have an anxiety disorder. I'm just an anxious guy. But if I start to avoid flying in airplanes or avoid public speaking in order to not feel anxious, well, we know where that leads. People, eventually you wind up, in a small room with long fingernails and agoraphobia, right? Trying to get rid of the anxious feeling. We see this with insomnia. We see it with erectile dysfunction. We see it with so many different circumstances in which the attempt to control the thing and the attempt to avoid the unpleasant symptom causes more of it. And this is even what's going on in depression. If we think about the difference between sadness and depression, and I just invite our viewers to ponder that for a moment. Well, maybe I'll ask you if you don't mind. So how in your own experience are sadness and depression different? Because we've all experienced both to some extent.
It's interesting. I mean, that's a really interesting question. It's, sadness feels like a natural state in response to something that would objectively perhaps make one sad or is based on our history. But depression is that like crushing weight that it's always been like this. It's always going to be this way. There's a heaviness to it. And for me, both personally and professionally, I work with trauma in the brain. So I'm always thinking about executive functioning and the role of that, how your thinking is just different. Like with sadness, you might be able to think about the future, about what to do. But with depression, that thinking is so often impaired. Like I don't see the future.
And in sadness, it may be painful, but it's quite alive. And in fact, it can be poignant, right? When Shakespeare wrote, "Parting is such sweet sorrow," we know what he meant 400 years later. Had he said, "Parting is such sweet depression," we think, what? What's he talking about, right? Yeah. And we probably wouldn't still be reading them. So one way to understand depression is it's a kind of shutting down of the nervous system in order not to feel something painful. And in fact, for me, whenever I've been depressed and I start to work with it, there's a whole mix of other difficult feelings in there. There's usually sadness, maybe fear, maybe longing, maybe anger. And it's when I can connect with those underlying feelings, even if they're painful, and have the courage to really feel them, then the depression resolves and I'm back alive again, because depression's so deadening in a way that sadness is not. So we can see across, just use those three examples. Gosh, the things that our mind does or our brain does to try to avoid pain, the habits we get into, they cause us an awful lot of suffering. And here's one where we can really see how the development, say, of mindfulness practices, which are awareness of present experience with loving acceptance, opening to whatever is here, and feeling it, whether it's pleasant or whether it's painful, is a direct antidote to this, as are the psychedelics. Because when we, you can never tell what's going to happen in a psychedelic journey. And I've been following closely the MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They're now completed phase 3 trials of MDMA for PTSD. And one of the modal responses on the part of the participants, MDMA is the principal ingredient, or supposed to be the principal ingredient in the street drug, ecstasy. Anyway, the participants say, why do they call this ecstasy? Because in the context of therapy, people are going inside with the assistance of the medicine, but they're encountering all sorts of difficulties. And in fact, I just add one more perspective on this. If we go back and we look at the Buddha's history, at least as it's reported to us, there's this point after he had developed all this expertise and all of these contemplative practices, was, a really, really skilled meditator, skilled yogi, and he could be in these concentrated states that were just laser focused on an object, let's say a candle or something like that. And it's very peaceful when that happens. But he discovered as soon as I'm not meditating, basically all my old neuroses come back and I'm tortured again. He didn't use that language, but that's my understanding of what he meant. And then he said, all right, I got to figure out what this is all about. And he went out, to sit under this tree that we later came to call the Bodhi tree, or the tree of wisdom. He sat there for like 49 days and nights, which in that era meant a long time. Right. It was a long time. And he was visited by every conceivable pleasant or unpleasant phenomena. They say that Mara, who was a demon in the mythology of the time, would send these like beautiful maidens. He'd send, like luscious foods and intoxicants, all this stuff. And he also send, monsters and, evil sadistic soldiers and all sorts of stuff. And the Buddha learned how to say yes to all of it. Like that was the key. That's what he then later came and taught us as mindfulness practices. So clearly that was a direct antidote to this propensity. And it is one of the common features of all of these non-ordinary states that we use for healing, that one of the common features is facing our demons, opening to pain, and really moving with curiosity toward the things that normally we want to eschew and push out of awareness.
That's so interesting because I really incorporate that in preparation, like more and more the longer that I've been doing this. I've been doing ketamine work since 2019 at this point, and really just telling people like what we're doing is we're just cultivating a curiosity. We're just simply going with it. We're opening to it, and we're just learning to be with it. And, the parallels to mindfulness practice with that that is mindfulness practice.
Yeah.
Right.
My friend Bill Richards, who's the last psychologist to legally administer psilocybin in the United States as part of a research study before the war on drugs shut it down, who's now in his 80s. And he said, yeah, we had a formula back then in all the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and it's still the formula now, which is instill in people 3 basic, very interrelated principles. Trust, let go, and open to whatever unfolds. And it's a perfect preparation for mindfulness practice. It's a perfect way to, perfect kind of touchstone to come back to for mindfulness practices as well.
Well, and, one of the things that I have learned and coming to learn and eternally learning in my life as a mindfulness practitioner and also a psychedelic psychotherapist is, when we're first learning something, we make it very, very complicated. Like, am I doing it right? And all these different things. And, and coming back to that place of simplicity and trusting, I love what you just said, like trusting, letting go, being open, and just teaching that as a way to enter into psychedelic assisted psychotherapy.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, in the context of mindfulness practices, so many people, especially when they do intensive retreat practice, will encounter, some state of bliss, some state of concentration, some state of relinquishing ego concerns. And it feels so good to not be so worried about me for a few minutes. And, but then what happens is, oh, how do I reproduce that? How do I keep that going? And it's like, nope, sorry, that's not it. It's about trust, let go, and open to all the states, including the states of clinging, including the states of self-preoccupation and self-aggrandizement or self-denigration. It's about opening to all of it. And it's the attitude that we learn how to take forward much more than any particular state.
Well, it's interesting. I feel like that's something that people come out of kind of a surface level study of mindfulness with, that they're supposed to be like, the goal is eternal bliss. And I actually say that in session all the time. I'm like, it's not eternal bliss. Like, that's not what we're going for. It's not like a permanent state of happiness. Like, that's lovely. Like you said, if you can stay in a meditative state forever, like on a beautiful mountain and, like, awesome. And I wish you well with that, but that's not realistic. And I don't even think that's that's not life.
Yeah, that's not life. I think that, as a householder, they'd call it in Buddhist traditions, active in the world, it's very unlikely that we're going to stay in those kinds of states. I mean, if you reverse engineer, the Buddha's early tradition, if you will, he had these monks and nuns, with 500 rules, right, to try to regulate everything and not owning anything more than a begging bowl and a robe, and not touching money and not having any, sexual relationship. And reverse engineering that, we can say, oh, well, so he was kind of acknowledging that unless you make it that simple and you're that focused just on your meditation practice, it's going to be very, very hard to feel sane. And, I find that actually a comforting take-home point. Like, okay, so we'll start with the expectation that I'm going to be nuts here, but let me see, how am I going to work with that? How am I going to change my relationship to that? And that's what I think we're doing with all of these different non-ordinary states.
Well, and it's funny because that's also a parallel to the psychedelic psychotherapy process, like helping clients understand, like, this is not linear. This might not even make sense. I'm your scribe. It's my job as the therapist who's with you to help you make sense. But we're not doing that right now. We'll do that later in the integration piece. It's okay to be a bit insane. It's okay to have things not make sense. And that in and of itself, I think, is a really important teaching, that everything doesn't always make linear sense in every given moment.
Right.
So, all right. Well, moving on to the second one, the ability and the propensity to think. And I know that that is obviously all over the mindfulness world, but I wanted to specifically kind of, dial into this piece that you had said, thoughts create suffering, and that the real problem is the negativity bias. Yeah. I'm really interested in this part, the tendency for the brain to remember bad and not good, right? And how that relates to our survival needs and the survival kind of urges within the brain, that's sort of at the top of the hierarchy. I'm just wondering if you can talk to that piece.
Sure. Yeah. It's, I observe it all the time in my own psyche. If you can imagine our ancestor, again, out there on the African savannah, this time looking at an ambiguous situation. Let's say there's a beige or kind of a yellow shape behind some bushes. Well, our ancestor could make one of two types of errors, and they correspond to type 1 and type 2 errors in modern scientific research. A type 1 error would be a false positive, which would be to look at the shape and go, oh my God, it's a lion, when in reality, it was just a beige rock. A type 2 error would be a false negative, which would be say, I bet it's a beige rock, when in reality, it was a lion. Now, those of our ancestors could have made countless type 1 errors and still lived to reproduce, take care of their kids. One type 2 error, that's the end of your DNA line. So we might imagine that in the random mutations of the brains back in the day, that there were some that were mostly kind of remembering the good stuff and having the positive memory. And they would be, sitting around telling stories about luscious pieces of fruit and dynamite sexual encounters and lovely weather. But they historically were not our ancestors. And the reason was because statistically, they died before they got to reproduce. Our ancestors were the ones with this negativity bias going around the savannah going, oh my God, that could be a lion. Looks like could be one of those poisonous snakes. Oh no, one of those bushes with those thorns. Remember what happened last time? And as my friend Rick Hansen puts it, the negativity bias is the way in which the brain evolved to be like Velcro for bad experiences and Teflon for good ones. Bad experiences stick, we remember them, we anticipate them, and we imagine them happening again. And good ones slide right off the pan. I was recently interviewed by somebody doing a piece on optimism. And I happen not to be a fan of optimism because I think that both optimism and pessimism are delusional because they are what we do when we have uncertainty. And by definition, with uncertainty, we don't know if it's going to be a good outcome or a bad outcome. But the negativity bias certainly predisposes us toward the pessimism because we're remembering that bad stuff and anticipating it. And that certainly makes us quite miserable. So we have this propensity, and we have the reality that as modern humans, if we're fortunate enough to live in a sufficiently developed society and to be sufficiently privileged in that society, we're not actually under acute threat much of the time, but we're under symbolic threat quite regularly. So if I could ask, you and our viewers to just take a moment and think of something that upsets you. Please, not the worst thing ever, but just something that's a little bit upsetting. And then reflect here and now. If it weren't for the thought of the thing, would you be having a problem?
No.
Yeah, the answer is almost always no. Even if the upsetting thing is like physical discomfort, some kind of pain, it's usually the thought that it's going to get worse or less forever, or it portends my death. That's what really upsets us. The actual physical discomfort, if it's not too intense, we're okay with that. So we start to realize that, oh my gosh, almost all the misery we create is created with our thinking, and it's created because of this negativity bias in the brain, which is, makes perfect sense for survival, but it's not good for happiness. And it's not an accident that CBT developed, right? The whole, an entire approach to psychotherapy that's just about, well, let's examine the thoughts and see what we can do about the negative ones that are making me miserable. So it turns out that these non-ordinary states, the expanded states that are useful for healing and growth and spiritual awakening, they all share this component of learning how to step out of the thought stream. With mindfulness practices, we do it quite deliberately. The reason why virtually all mindfulness practices use as their primary object of attention the breath or sounds or the sensations of the feet on the ground, they use physical sensations, right? And that's a way to begin to ground consciousness in sensory reality rather than living in our thought stream as we normally do. And the more we do that, and you see this particularly if you do more intensive retreat practice, what starts to happen is instead of consciousness being mostly thinking and then occasionally tasting, seeing, and touching, and then thinking about what we've tasted, seen, and touched, what happens is consciousness becomes predominantly tasting, seeing, touching, feeling the body here and now present, noticing the natural environment around us or the human-made environment, and thoughts start to appear against that backdrop. So the oft-repeated instruction, allow thoughts to come and go like clouds in a vast sky. The idea is that the sky remains. Sometimes it's filled with stars, sometimes with the moon, sometimes with the sun, sometimes with rain or snow, with clouds. But the sky, somehow awareness remains, and these objects appear and disappear, appear and disappear. And this is a very common feature. We see this in mindfulness practices, and we see it in psychedelic work, right? That there's this field of consciousness and, the constant contents arising and contents passing, arising and passing. And the perspective that we gain on this, that it's like, okay, whatever arises in the journey, I can, again, trust, let go, and open to it, starts to shift our relationship, particularly to the thought contents, where we start to see, oh, there's one of those scared thoughts. Oh, there's one of those hungry thoughts. Oh, there's one of those lonely or inadequate thoughts. And it is so different to have the thought of, oh yeah, I had one of my inadequacy thoughts again, is such a different experience from I'm inadequate.
Mm. Well, it's interesting. I feel like this is another place where, mindfulness practice meets the neurobiological approaches to, working with trauma, like Bessel van der Kolk's work. And, really as we move into EMDR and things. And I was just wondering, I heard you say, I wrote this down, it make it hopefully word for word, to get out of the thought stream, we need to repeatedly connect deeply to sensation. And I was just wondering, because I think when our nervous system gets really activated, then our thoughts are going to be more in that negativity bias. And they're going to have that survival, like, oh, this is something that's killing or eating me. I have to really get ready and get activated into that fight flight piece. And so I'm just wondering, do you see that as being the same or different than somatic kind of interventions, like body-based interventions to calm the nervous systems? Like, how do you think those map together? Are they one and the same? Are they different?
Well, it's very interesting, and it speaks to an area of a good deal of confusion, because oftentimes people learning these things don't differentiate between the following. Very often mindfulness practices are confused with relaxation practices, right? Mm-hmm. That it's like, well, I practice mindfulness. I do 4-7-8 breathing, for example, where you breathe in to the count of 4 and then you hold the breath for 7 and you breathe out to the count of 8. Now, that kind of controlled breathing is designed specifically to energize the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system and to calm us. And it's great. It works to help to calm us. It is not a mindfulness practice per se, because it is not necessarily inching us toward being more aware and have more loving acceptance toward our experience. It's much more about shifting our experience from one state to another. Now, it has its place, right? There are lots of situations where we sense, oh gosh, I'm in a state of arousal, which is not helpful for living this life I'm trying to live. Perhaps it's very unpleasant, but on top of that, it's unskillful. It narrows my attention. It makes me irritable, So absolutely, there's a role for that in all sorts of yoga practices. And, even the occasional use of a benzodiazepine has its place in the world. But that's not about that kind of emotion regulation isn't the same as mindfulness practice. Now, saying that, It's interesting that John Kabat-Zinn snuck mindfulness practice as a Trojan horse into medical care by calling it stress reduction. And it is and it isn't, depending. And here's where this becomes very complicated. Because if we're really interested in mindfulness practice, we're really simply interested in being with whatever's happening with attention and acceptance. And that could be to be mindful of rage. It could be being mindful of intense states of anxiety. It could be mindful of intense states of sadness. It could be anything, some of which, though, are intense arousal states. And this is where you see people having different views toward equanimity, right? Because there's the idea, oh, I want to be equanimous. I want to be so zen so that no matter what happens, no matter what my partner says or does, I'm just peaceful and fine and all that. Well, that's one model of equanimity. It's not a terribly realistic one as a householder. Another model of equanimity is I want to get to the point where I'm not afraid of my arousal states, where I'm okay if my heart is racing, 1,000 beats a minute when I'm on stage about to do public speaking, and I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm okay when I see red and, I'm ready to kill this other driver or worse, my family member, and I'm all activated. Because there's also a way in which consciousness is holding this with some perspective, allowing it, experiencing it, but not fighting it, nor even identifying with it, but simply experiencing the experience. And here's where we get into enormous complexity. So let's say we're doing mindfulness practice and trying to develop a kind of equanimity, but this kind of equanimity, the very alive equanimity. Interestingly, when we're not fighting anger and resisting it, when we're not fighting fear and resisting it, when we're not fighting sadness and resisting it, it tends to reach a crescendo, and it tends to pass relatively quickly. Two of my good friends were wonderful guinea pigs for the whole community of meditating clinicians here in Boston, because they did a 4-year silent meditation retreat. Their names are Bill and Susan.
That is not householders.
No, their names are Bill and Susan Morgan, and they're a couple, and they did that. And the rest of us were really watching this experiment, like what's going to happen, right? And when they were done, Bill was still very much Bill, and Susan was still very much Susan. And in fact, they had pretty similar emotional responses. I happened to have the chance to be teaching with them. They came out of retreat a little bit during the third year to start easing into life. And I had the opportunity to co-lead a retreat with them. And it was in New Mexico. And wouldn't you know it, their flight got canceled. And Bill said, "Oh my God, it was just like I had never gone on the retreat. I was
just like same old thing. Here we are,
filled with anxiety, and then other people cutting in line, and hey, wait a minute, and how dare you, and all this stuff." He said, "But a much shorter tail. Like as soon as the thing was over, gone, able to let it go." So one of the interesting things that happens with these, with mindfulness practice and this whole issue of emotion regulation is when we learn to not fight these different elements, they still come up. The afflictive emotions still arise. But if we're not fighting them, if we're not blocking them, if we're not wrestling with them, they can be metabolized. They can come and they can pass. And then the net result is actually in aggregate, we're less stressed, but not because we tried to calm down.
Right.
We're less stressed because we gave wide permission, as Suzuki Roshi, the head of the San Francisco Zen Center, posed years ago in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. He said, if you have a really upset cow or sheep and you want to help it to calm down, what do you think you should do? Tie it up or tell it to calm down, or give it a wide, safe pasture? And the right answer is you give it a wide, safe pasture, and then it calms down by itself. So this whole relationship between the mindfulness and motion regulation and relaxation is actually quite complex.
Right. Well, it's super interesting, and I'm aware of the time, but I'm dying to ask you like one more specific question about this particular piece, if I can, which is one of the things that I have been tracking is the degree to which the more activated, roused people's nervous system are, the more I believe they have a tendency to focus on what I call the what or the other, like the problem or the fact what this person did or is doing. And that's one of the biggest challenges where I see people having a difficult time unplugging and labeling, using observer mind, being able to kind of notice the pattern, rise up above it, because it's so much about the what or the other. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to that piece.
Yeah, no, I think you're describing something important there, because when we're in these aroused states are typically variations on fight or flight states. And when we're in these states, our attention narrows, right? And we don't see the big picture, and we're focused on survival. And when we're focused on survival, we're not great at mentalization, right? We're not great at taking the perspective of the other, of seeing the big picture and all of that. So there is a role for learning how to calm down some. It's just, it's just there's a dynamic tension between, okay, I'm going to deliberately relax here, again, using the 4-7-8 breathing pattern is just one example, or I'm going to go for a run to, have the anxiolytic effect of using the larger muscle groups in the body. There's that approach, perfectly useful. And then there's the approach of, no, I'm just going to be with this and allow it to metabolize by not trying to control it or fight it or even change it, but just deeply accept it.
All right. So don't do the thing, just be with it before doing the thing.
Yeah. No, this is not a polemic for going out and like hitting people and stuff like that.
Right. Good. Well, so the third one is we tend to see things that are fixed as being static.
Yeah. Well, we tend to see things as fixed or static and not see the fluidity. This is here. Well, this is the Bill and Susan story again. It illustrates it so well that so often when we're struggling with an emotion, it's the fantasy that this emotion is going to last forever that bollocks us up. I got to get rid of the sadness because I'm afraid that it won't change by itself. I got to get rid of this fear because I'm afraid it won't change by itself. I got to do something about the fact that I'm angry and get revenge because I'm afraid it won't change by itself. And one of the things we learned from these expanded states is consciousness is extremely fluid. And particularly if we're not resisting an element of consciousness, it keeps changing. We see this all the time in the psychedelic-assisted work, aided a bit by the music, right? One of the reasons why Stan Grof and others, started using music to help people through these psychedelic journeys, and it's still done in current research and clinical work a lot, is because the music, as it's continually changing, sort of signals, it's a new stanza, helps us to see the fluidity. And we certainly see the fluidity of consciousness with mindfulness practice. One minute we're like, blissed out, enjoying the present moment, feeling one with the universe. The next minute, it's like, I want to watch TV. I hate this mindfulness crap, and so we see it. So that's the third one is just getting it, that really everything does constantly change. And that includes the elements of consciousness. And the more we see that, the less upset about a given state of consciousness we are, and the less driven to try to change it we become.
Love it. All right. So the fourth one then, and I love this. I got a lot out of your teachings with this, just to kind of really map it on to make it so personal. A tendency to create narratives about ourselves that involve judgments. And you talked about it's evolutionarily beneficial to compare ourselves to others.
Yeah. This is the big enchilada of our affliction, right? It's our preoccupation with us, and particularly with the whole realm of social comparison and self-esteem. My casual observation of my own consciousness and that of virtually everybody I've worked with is that we're either stressed out trying desperately to keep our self-image and self-esteem afloat, or we're bummed out, feeling in some way not good enough and inadequate, and looking for a plan of self-improvement to be able to feel good about ourselves. And the origins to this, as I understand it, are the concern with where we rank in the primate troop. If you go on a so-called safari in Africa, which basically means riding in a Jeep with a naturalist, the naturalist will point out the same pattern in species after species after species. There's like a dominant male hanging around with literally a harem of reproductively promising females. And over in the next field, there's another group of guys, usually a bit younger, doing the species-specific equivalent of playing basketball, trying to get the talent and skills together to be able to become dominant. What's up with that? Why are there species of crickets that if you put them together in a box, inside of a few minutes, have organized themselves into a dominance hierarchy? Why do kids by the age of 4 establish what are called transitive dominance hierarchies? Transitivity being the principle from math, that if A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, then A is bigger than C. So if Juanita knows that she can dominate George, and George knows that he can lord it over Susie, Susie knows to be afraid of Juanita and to basically give into her wishes. And kids figure this out like right away. Adults, you can just play them the tonal quality of other people's voices, and they will predict accurately who will be dominant and who will be subservient in a group. Like, this stuff is very strongly hardwired. What we have in common is this propensity to compare ourselves to one another, even though different criteria are more salient for one of us than they are for the other. For example, I got hooked at a very early age on intelligence. I discovered I could use big words, and teachers and parents would like that, and it served to make me feel good about myself, and it was a great compensation for things like being picked last or close to last on a kickball team, and not being very good at standing up and physically fighting and that kind of thing. And I've kind of been attached to that my whole life, right? Wanting to be seen as smart, to be able to feel okay about myself. For somebody else, it's being physically attractive becomes what they put a lot of energy into. For somebody else, it's being artistically creative. For somebody else, it's having a sense of fashion and that kind of thing, or knowing what's current in the culture. For somebody else, it's being seen as the nice one, or the kind one, or the generous one. And I'm not knocking any of these attributes, whether it's creativity or intelligence or kindness, they're all wonderful. But when we get hooked on needing to see ourselves this way, that sets us up for a tremendous amount of suffering, because we simply can't win at this game for two reasons. One is we recalibrate, right? So whatever used to float our boat doesn't do it anymore. When we were really little and we put together those multicolored wooden or plastic rings on a pole, and we got in the right order and it looked like a cone or a Christmas tree, it was like, hey, look, mommy, look, daddy, I can do it. It doesn't float our boat so much anymore. I mean, it might in the nursing home after a while, but at the moment it's not, it's not doing it, right? And similarly, I like to do trainings for mental health professionals. And I'll often remind everybody, what it was like to get our terminal degrees, right? And it was a big deal, right? We worked so hard for that, and we're so proud of it. And then I asked, so how many of you woke up this morning feeling good about yourself because you have your terminal degree? And exactly your response, right? Everybody starts, cracking up laughing, except sometimes there's one newly minted clinician, they raise their hand and say, why is everybody laughing? Because the problem is we habituate to all this stuff, and then we look for something else. We need something else to feel good about ourselves. And on top of that, what goes up goes down. So even if we're an Olympic gold medalist, what are the chances of winning the gold in 4 years and 8 years, right? So this absolutely doesn't work. And yet it is so built into us. Clinically, everybody I work with struggles with not feeling good about themselves in some way. And they're either, on the narcissistic side of it, and they're always like, proving themselves, or they're just Eeyore and they're just feeling like, how come everybody else is good in some way, and and I'm not. And the really interesting thing is, where the Buddhist practices lead, where mindfulness practices lead, it's toward seeing all of this as just constructed, seeing that the whole thing, these are narratives that we invent for ourselves. And, they're actually not real. Nobody has more value than anybody else. We're all going to die anyway. The whole thing is just nuts. And we can actually get glimpses of this. And with psychedelics, we can get really profound glimpses of this sometimes, where we really see, oh my God, the pain of it. I've spent my whole life trying to prove something to me or to others. And the whole thing has been completely and utterly unnecessary and an illusion. People really see this with psychedelics, and it is profoundly liberating. And I got really interested in this topic a number of years ago, because there I was already in my 60s and spend years doing, Buddhist meditation practice, decades doing psychotherapy, having been in psychotherapy, having experimented with psychedelics. And you'd think by that time I would have developed something called the secure, stable sense of self, right? Self-image. Nope. I was still going up and down, often several times a day, depending on what was in my email inbox. And certainly based on how the last session went, if the last session went well, yeah, I'm, all these years of study and practice and introspection, I'm a really talented psychologist. That was a good session. If it went poorly, it was like, I knew I was a bright guy. I could have gone into so many fields. This is clearly not my calling, and feeling terrible about it. So it was out of that I became very interested in, are there reliable ways to step off of this roller coaster and actually establish a kind of well-being that's not about boosting self-esteem, but that's embracing the reality of being a human like other humans? And that actually led to a self-treatment project, which is a book called The Extraordinary Gift of Being Ordinary, Finding Happiness Right Where You Are. And the book is just methods for maybe doing something about this fourth affliction, if you will, this propensity to compare ourselves with others and be concerned with social rank.
It's a great book, by the way. I really enjoy it. I'm glad that you brought it up. I think that it's so interesting too, that's just biological. And I really find that clients just resonate with being told, when you tell somebody, oh, that's just your biology, this biological propensity towards distress, right? And that happiness is a learned skill, growing the good. I've been really influenced by Rhett Kanson's work in that area. And that it's a biological necessity for you to compare yourself to other people that are up the hierarchy. Therefore, you will always do it.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's real.
Right.
That doesn't mean that you have to give into it. If it's biological, then we just notice it, right? And to me, that for me, teaching that it's biological becomes an entry point to give people more of a permission. This is why we use mindfulness, because
Absolutely.
You're going to do that no matter what.
And I would just quibble with one word. It's a biological propensity rather than necessity.
Gotcha.
Because luckily we have some other instincts, like instincts toward cooperation, instincts toward connection, instincts toward noticing our place in the universe. So it's a propensity. But the way I like to think of it is that, it's like the love of fat and sugar, right? That propensity exists because, back in the day, they're associated with nutrients, right? So every culture has its equivalent of a donut. Yet we can learn that going for donuts every day, doesn't actually bring a lot of well-being after a while. So it's the same thing. These are all propensities, but we can learn that they don't actually serve us. And then we can cultivate the antidotes to them.
Right. I love that. So I want to spend the last chunk of time, if we can, talking about really some applied pieces. So I work full-time in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, looking forward to the day when other psychedelics are available for legal use for psychotherapy, but really find tremendous benefit with ketamine, and am involved in a training program through the Living Medicine Institute, teaching therapists how to do clinical practice using psychedelics. And I know you have certainly been involved in that as an educator and a trainer, and really driving that movement yourself. And I'm really curious about some of your thoughts about if we're going to break psychedelic assisted psychotherapy into preparation, the actual psychedelic session, and integration. Like, what are some of the things that you might, just starting with the preparation piece in general, what are some things that you might teach? And then specific skills. Are there things that you might incorporate into preparation when working with clients?
Well, there's a lot we don't know about this. I would start with what Bill Richards, as an elder in this field, says: look for ways to try to help the client or patient to cultivate an attitude of trust, let go, and open. And for a given individual, there may be very different techniques that are going to help that. For one person, teaching mindfulness practice, starting with, an object such as the breath, staying with it, allowing the mind when it goes off into the thought stream to do what it does, see if we can notice it when it goes into the thought stream and gently and lovingly bring it back, and just doing that over and over and over again. And then having a warm and welcoming attitude toward whatever else comes up, like the longing for love, like the fear of rejection, like the memory of past small or larger T trauma. And, to really practice saying yes to everything that arises. So that can be done through mindfulness practice, but it can be done through other things too. It can be done through a kind of, Rogerian psychotherapy as a preparation, in which the person is simply invited to talk about what happens, and we as a therapist take an attitude of deep acceptance and curiosity in it. Or, and people are experimenting with this, perhaps something like internal family systems work, where people deliberately allow space for the different parts of us to be recognized, acknowledged, and to notice what they all need, because the psychedelic assisted work tends to help us connect with those parts, what my friend Dick Schwartz would call the exiles, the parts of us that we don't like and we try to push out of awareness. Those tend to come into awareness, and the various protector parts, the things that keep us away from this, they get quieted, maybe even anesthetized a little bit by the psychedelics, so that we can connect with these vulnerable parts. So doing some of that work in that therapy style, that could make sense. There are people using ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, as part of preparation. And ACT is also a very strongly acceptance-based kind of treatment, and it's a little bit more cognitive in its orientation. But what it does is it helps people to see that, all elements are welcome and all thoughts are welcome, and noticing that all the thoughts that we have arise against this basic backdrop of awareness itself. And they call that self in context, if in the ACT system. So that could be a way in. And, for somebody who's theistic, it could be a prayer practice. It could be something about, God in some way, or another divine presence, and working with having them as a benefactor to feel safe in going into it. But so I think the key is whatever is going to move us in the direction of trusting, letting go, and opening, we want to do. But that could come from quite a number of different therapeutic or spiritual traditions. I mean, my bailiwick's more mindfulness practice, so that's where I would go with my own personal work, most likely. But I think it could depend on the person which one you'd want to emphasize.
Well, it's interesting. I'm just kind of sitting here just reflecting on just even starting with that. So we're going to start preparation. Like I'm an assessment person, which I was before. So I do a pretty extensive assessment, but just kind of also beginning with like really the goal of this preparation phase is to help you get to a place where you can trust, let go, and be open. Right. That might be a really interesting thing just to put out there. Like, and ask them, like, what are you doing already? What can you see that would be helpful for this? I could see that as being a really nice way to actually start in a more like dialogue with the client right from minute one to bring them in to the process.
Yeah. And it models that this is going to be a cooperative journey that we're going to take together, in which I can support you, but it's your own heart and mind is going to be leading the show.
I love that. So what about during the treatment itself? And by the treatment itself, I'm specifically referencing ketamine right now, which is about 60 minutes under the influence and about a 2-hour session. I mostly do IV. So that would be IV and IM, particularly. Other forms last longer. But I'm just wondering, if you have thoughts about kind of drawing from mindfulness or kind of this piece is about the 4 propensities of mind. Obviously, you don't know what's going to come up, and every single session, every single ketamine session is different. So certainly we understand that. So it's not like it's scripted or prescripted, but just if you kind of reflect on that, just sitting with the client while they're in the actual altered state, you as a provider, what might you suggest?
Well, I'd suggest something like mindfulness practice for us as providers, so that we can be as fully present and as fully accepting of whatever arises as possible, and where it morphs into a mindfulness practice where the object of our attention is our client or our patient, right? Where we're just being with them in as open-hearted a way as we can, and maybe adding in some compassion practice also to just add some warmth to the presence. But then for the client or the patient, I think much depends on the dose and what kind of work we're doing. At more modest doses, you can do ketamine-assisted mindfulness practice. At least I've done it, where what I'm doing is starting with practice, actually starting with a period of practice without the medicine, adding in the medicine, and continuing for, including perhaps on a meditation cushion, continuing the practice and keeping the same attitude of being grounded in the breath or another object of awareness, but really allowing whatever arises to arise and investigating what arises. My friend Tara Brock's done a lot to popularize this idea of RAIN as a mode of inquiry with mindfulness practice. And it involves recognizing whatever's arising, investigating it, but investigating it not cognitively and analytically, investigating the way you would look at a rare and beautiful flower. Recognizing, accepting is next. The A is next. So it's this attitude of acceptance, then investigating. And then the N is kind of resting in natural awareness, simply allowing it to be there, opening to it very fully. So we can kind of use a mindfulness practice to work with whatever arises in the medication induced states. And at least my experience with moderate doses of ketamine is it allows kind of wandering in the mind. The hallucination means to wander in the mind, literally.
I love that.
That's why some people are advocating that we go back to, instead of calling them psychedelics, calling them hallucinogens, because they allow us to wander in the mind. And it's true, the medicine allows for a kind of wandering in the mind with greater freedom and less fear than unassisted mindfulness practice might. So at a higher dose, the medicine is going to take over, and there'll be very little volition in terms of steering the experience. So mindfulness practice is one possibility. One could, at the lower psycholytic doses, do whatever is psychotherapeutic. Certainly, I know that Dick Schwartz has been active in some workshops doing this of let's do IFS work. Let's talk to parts with a low dose of ketamine and have the active medicine session be a all parts are welcome opportunity to talk about parts and unburden them, allow them to talk about difficulties they've had so that they can be healed. So I think there's a lot of possibilities at the lower dose. At the higher doses, I think it's about supporting the journey.
Right. I'm interested once again in that piece just about like I haven't done this, but I'm going to experiment with it. Like, what if I teach a client about rain, like prior to going in? Do they have less fear? Are they more able to drop in if they understand that really, I'm just grabbing hold of that one. There's, could be many, but like, that recognizing and acknowledging and investigating and just, that is what we're doing.
Yeah.
Like, I think that might be a nice.
No, I'm a big fan. I'm with you. I'm a big fan of psychoeducation and giving people maps for both what I'm thinking and how this might unfold and what guidelines other people have found useful. Absolutely makes sense to me.
I love that. Just to hit the last piece, just integration. So integration, for those who don't know, are sessions that take place shortly after, in the ketamine assisted psychotherapy world, shortly after the session, where we're going to go over, review what happened in the session and find ways to make it meaningful in your life.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's wide open in terms of whatever is, however we might work therapeutically with a powerful experience. And it could certainly be spending time with mindfulness practice or, taking walks in the woods and allowing the holding that comes from nature. We really want to provide space for whatever needs to surface and to be able to allow it to come and go freely. So, I'm certainly inclined towards something contemplative that way, but I could easily see it being also a talking therapy that really talked about the different elements and the meaning of them. And particularly in integration, to be exploring. So what was it like to have your typical defenses or your typical modes of coping or navigating, to start seeing them coming back after the session? Because very often in psychedelic assisted work, there are these experiences of liberation, right? It was like, I tasted freedom. And then the disappointment that can come in when it's like, Ron's back. Oh no!
Oh no! That was good.
That was so nice. It's so nice. To not have the normal preoccupations. So to also really be exploring them and to be open-minded about what happens and but also IFS, ACT, EMDR. I mean the list is long of treatment modalities that can help us to integrate material that's come up.
Good. Well, I wanted to just kind of wrap it up there, but I wanted to, before we do that, I want to just ask you, is there anything else you'd like to share about, or anything else you want to talk about?
Well, I think we've covered a lot of interesting territory. I really appreciate your questions and this kind of inquiry of what's this interface between contemplative practice, psychedelic exploration, and psychotherapy is, I think it's fascinating. And, anybody involved in exploring this, it's not like there's a roadmap. I don't know if there ever will be a roadmap, but it's certainly interesting and fascinating area to explore.
Well, it's an exciting time to be involved in it. And once again, I'm just really grateful to you for taking the time. But I'm also just grateful for you as in your humanity as a teacher and as an educator, and just being so real with all of this and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge, and you're really making a difference in the world. And I appreciate that. So
thank you so much. Thank you for saying so. And thank you for all that you're doing in the world and for organizing this and for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to Living Medicine. We'll see you again next time. Be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.